All right, so here we are, chapter 3 in the book of Judges. So we had lots of introductions that we dealt with in the last two classes, and now we're getting right into it. Now, if you'll recall, last week at the end of chapter 2, we talked about how the end of chapter 2 really tells the story of the whole book of Judges. You know, the nation sins, then God sends a nation or a group of people to make their lives very uncomfortable, and then they cry out to God. God then sends some kind of a savior or a leader, and then things are resolved until they forget God the next time. And that is the story of the book of Judges. And what we will see today is how that story begins. We actually, in this chapter, see three different judges. The second one, Ehud, son of Gera, is the one that has a whole story. The others are very, very brief. So let's read through and start seeing what it is we're talking about. Okay, chapter 3. These are the nations that the Lord left so that he might test by them all the Israelites who had not known any of the wars of Canaan, so that succeeding generations of Israelites might be made to experience war, but only those who had not known the former wars. Okay, so this really connects with what we read about last week in chapter 2, the fact that there is a situation going on here where these nations that are left for the Israelites to continue conquering are, that God leaves them there on purpose, and there's actually two different things going on. The fact that they did not continue the process of conquest and driving out the nations and settling the land creates a situation where they will sin, okay? But by the same point, what we see here is that, and we saw it also in chapter 2, that one of the reasons God leads the nations here is to test the people to see, will they withstand these negative influences? Will they indeed follow through and finish the job? So it's both a test and a punishment of sorts, okay? But there's another reason here that we receive for the first time, and that is to teach them the art of war. In other words, it's going to be very important for the nation of Israel to continue understanding how to defend the country. The living in the land of Israel is accompanied by many miracles, but God is telling us here that it is not a miraculous existence. We can't sit back in our living rooms and expect for God to just wave his wand and ensure that we never have to worry about anything again. We will have ongoing military and strategic challenges, and therefore God has left these nations here so that we will continue to be practiced in the art of war. And here it talks about for the succeeding generations. And what this is doing is essentially distinguishing between that generation who, together with Joshua, had those initial wars. Now there's a next generation. The next generation is essentially, in many ways, receiving the land of Israel on a silver platter. In fact, it is a very interesting poem that was written at the beginning of the state of Israel, a Hebrew poem talking about the generation who received the land of Israel today, the state of Israel, on a silver platter. And the need for the next generation to, on the one hand, appreciate the sacrifice of the founding generation. And here we have another aspect, not just to appreciate the sacrifice, they must appreciate the skills. They must themselves learn the skills, because just because they have the land now doesn't mean they won't be challenged in an ongoing way from enemies surrounding, because that's the way of life, okay? And therefore, we have both of those things going on here, both this idea of a spiritual test, but also in a very practical way, ensuring that the nation will learn and keep in practice and how to fight wars. And now we have here a list of the actual nations that are still around. The 5 principalities, or I would more accurately translate as the 5 leaders or the 5 princes of the Philistines, and all the Canaanites, Sidonians, and Hivites who inhabited the hill country of the Lebanon from Mount Baal Hermon to Lebo Hamat. Now, these are areas, of course, the Sidonians, Hivites, and Lebanon. That's all in the north. These are places that are today Lebanon and Syria. The mention here of the Philistines, this is the first time that we have a mention of the Philistines since the time of Abraham. Until now, throughout the book of Joshua and the beginning of the book of Judges, we have only heard about Canaanites. And a lot of these are parts of the Canaan. The Hivites, for example, is part of the Canaanites. And there's the Amorites. These are part of the Canaanites. These are a type, a subdivision of the Canaanites. But the Philistines is something completely different. Now, the word Philistine in Hebrew, the word is plishtim, and it comes from the word polesh, which means to invade. And so the two different groups of Philistines, the groups from Abraham and the groups that we read here in Judges that continue through into the book of Samuel, are two different groups of people. What they have in common is that they are invaders. In both cases, they came from the sea. And they, in similar places, in the time of Abraham, they're in an area called Gerar, and that is the area of the Gaza Strip and south, a bit further south of the Gaza Strip. In these Philistines are Gaza Strip and north, okay? And basically they are controlling the whole, at some point, here is just hinted at, but later we will see, they are controlling the most of the coast along the Mediterranean Sea. There's a strip there, that strip of land, most of that is in the hands of the Philistines. And what happens is it is about this time that they come in and they invade and they take possession. And this is also an indication of a failure on the part of the children of Israel, who didn't completely capture the land. The coastal area has some Canaanites, but what happens is these Philistines, and another word for the Philistines are the nations of the sea. They come in from the sea, and we're going to talk more about that when we study chapters 4 and 5. We're beginning next week when we talk about Sisera and Yavin, king of Canaan, and how they connect to the Philistines. So that we will discuss that next week. But these are people that come in from the sea, from the Greek islands, from North Africa, places like that. They come in, and for the most part, by the way, they are mercenaries. A lot of them are mercenaries, and they're people of war. Okay, they don't get involved in nation building. Okay, they get involved in grabbing and taking and making sure that they have what they need, but they don't try to replace a given civilization or set up a country. But here's the first time that we meet these people. Okay, and then we have continuing in chapter 4. These served as a means of testing Israel to learn whether they would obey the commandments which the Lord had enjoined upon their fathers through Moses. The Israelites settled among the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. They took their daughters to wife and gave their own daughters to their sons, and they worshiped their gods. Here we see right away, if we said that God left these nations as a test, we see right away here in verse 6 that they failed the test. They were influenced by exactly what God says to them not to do. Don't intermarry, don't learn about their faith. That's exactly what they do. They start to mix and to worship their gods. The Israelites did was offensive to the Lord. They ignored the Lord their God and worshiped the Baalim and the Asherot. The Lord became incensed at Israel and surrendered them to King Cushan Rishathaim of Aram Naharaim. And the Israelites were subject to Cushan Rishathaim for 8 years. So this story, now we're going to start with the story of the first judge. This story begins very much fitting into the pattern that we've already learned about, fitting into exactly what God is warning us against, and this is exactly what happens. So we see they start to marry the children, they marry each other, they start worshiping the gods, they leave God, and as a result, God sends as a punishment this particular king. Okay, now I want to point out the English here is not as accurate. Okay. Actually, the word in verse 8, where it says, surrender them to this king, okay? The actual word in Hebrew is vayim kerem. He sold them, okay? And then it says that the children of Israel, in the English it says were subject to, but the actual word is vayavdu. They served or they were enslaved to. And I think it's very, very significant that the Hebrew verbs here use the verbs of slavery. They were sold to and they served as slaves, okay? And I think this recalls for us exactly what God is telling them from the beginning. He's telling them, I look at chapter 2, verse 12. Okay, when God is starting to say, this kind of overview of what happens in Judges. How is it written here in verse 12? And forsook the Lord of their fathers, who had brought them out of Egypt, brought them out of the land of Egypt. They followed other gods. Okay, and you'll see in other places where there is this focus on God who has redeemed them from Egypt to make the nation of Israel the servants of God. And we have that, of course, in many times in the book of Exodus and throughout the Bible. And I think by using these words of selling and enslaving, what there's here, the book of Judges is setting up the contrast. The plan is that God redeemed them from slavery in Egypt so they would then serve God. And instead, because of their sins, because they instead served the other gods, God now enslaves them sells them, if you will, enslaves them to a foreign power, to this man, this king, Kushan Rishatayim, the king of Aram. Now, I read an interesting commentary. This word Rishatayim, there's in that word the Hebrew word Risha or Resha, which means evil. Okay, and I read a commentary that said that they have found in documents in Mesopotamia names that are Rashid or Risha, but not written this way. And so there's a theory that perhaps his real name was Kushan Rashid or Kushan Risha or something like that. And they kind of adjusted the name to include the word evil, as if to say this is the way the Israelites refer to this man. This was that evil king, Kushan, and he certainly causes them great trouble. And they are enslaved to him for 8 years. Now, this is unusual because Aram Naharaim, this is Mesopotamia. He's coming way from the northeast. This is not a Canaanite nation. This is not someone who's coming from within the land of Israel. This is a power that's coming from abroad. We will later on in the book of Kings, we will see from that same area all kinds of threats that happen to from Aram to Ahab, for example. Later on, Assyria, which conquers Aram, becomes a major threat. But at this period of time, a threat coming from that far away is unusual. But I guess the guy was, for a short time, was quite a major power in the region. Okay, and then we have verse 9. The Israelites cried out to the Lord, and the Lord raised a champion or a savior for the Israelites to deliver them, Othniel, the son of Kenaz, a younger brother of Caleb. Now, we've already met Othniel. We met him in the book of Joshua when, and actually the story was repeated at the beginning in chapter 1 in the book of Judges, the story of Caleb who had conquered Hebron, and that became his territory. And then he says, whoever conquers Dvir will get my daughter as a wife. And so that's when we met Othniel, because he's the one who steps up to the plate and he conquers. So what we do know about Othniel from before is that he's already a proven military man. He's good at it. He's trained. He has experience. Okay, so this particular savior that God appoints, that sends, is a general. He already has that military experience, but here in verse 10, he's going to receive something extra. The Spirit of the Lord descended upon him, and he became Israel's chieftain. He went out to war, and the Lord delivered King Kushan Rishatayim of Aram into his hands. He prevailed over Kushan Rishatayim, and the land had peace for 40 years. Okay, this is our first judge. We have a judge who is military experienced, but he has this extra thing upon him. The Spirit of the Lord is upon him, and we will see there are very few other judges that have that same kind of thing, the Spirit of the Lord. And he is one of them. So I guess if you could say you take a general and you want to upgrade him, you put the Spirit of the Lord on him. And then, of course, and it seems that it's just very quick. He just goes out to war, he defeats him. So if you think of this king who's coming from far, and he's come so far and he's really managed to make a dent and to oppress the nation of Israel for 8 years. And this one guy comes and it seems in like one fell blow, he's gone, and that's it. And then they have 40 years of rest. Now, the important thing about this story is, first of all, it fits into the classic mode. We will see it becomes our point of reference. Okay, this story, the classic mode of the nation sitting, the foreign nation coming and enslaving or oppressing, and then a savior coming and saving the day. These are all part of the patterns. Whenever we continue and read the other stories, we're going to see to what degree they are similar to this pattern or this original story, and to what degree they are different. Okay, and one of the things that's also very important to see is the 40 year. Now, the numbers, many of the numbers in the Bible are what we would call typological numbers. They are not necessarily there in order to give a specific number of years, but they're approximate numbers, shall we say, but they come to represent something. And in the book of Judges, 40 years becomes your standard good time. And we see in the Bible in general, we have seen 40 before, okay? The classic example is Moses going up to Mount Sinai. Moses goes up to Mount Sinai. He's up there for 40 days and 40 nights. He goes up there twice for 40 days and 40 nights. And that number represents this completeness, this wholeness, this sense of perfection. Something amazing is accomplished in that 40 days and 40 nights. And so the nation of Israel wanders in the desert. They're punished to wander for 40 years. And this is parallel to the 40 days that the spies were in the land of Israel. So again, this becomes a very significant number, refers to the fact that it's a time that's significant, okay? So here we have in the book of Judges, 40 years becomes a significant time. If a savior, a judge ends up bringing peace to the land and it lasts for 40 years, you can see that as a period of time that is a normal period of time. It's not too short, it's not too long, but you get the sense that the judge was successful and that he created peace for a significant period of time. And I think that's what that 40 represents. And again, as we go on in the stories, we're going to be comparing back to this one, and we're going to also compare back to this idea of the 40 years. There will be some that will be shorter, there will be some that will be longer. That in itself will give us a message with regard to the effectiveness of the judge in that particular case. Okay, and then Othniel ben Kenaz, son of Kenaz, dies. Okay, end of that story. Now we're on to the next story. The Israelites again did what was offensive to the Lord, and because they did what was offensive to the Lord get King Eglon of Moab to prevail over Israel. Now Moab is already very close. Moab is just across the Jordan River, and there are the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and the half a tribe of Manasseh are also on the eastern side of the Jordan, so that Moab is literally a neighbor. Okay, there's Israelites north of them and Israelites south of them, and it's literally a neighbor of Israel, and just across the Jordan from the rest of the tribe. So he's not coming from far. He's a very local guy, and he's starting to cause trouble as a way of punishment that God has sent. Eglon brought the Ammonites and the Amalekites together under his command and went and defeated Israel and occupied the city of palms. The city of palms is Jericho. Okay, Jericho is west of the Jordan, but right there practically on the banks of the Jordan. We remember Jericho in the book of Joshua. It was the first place that was conquered. It was right after they crossed the Jordan River. Right there, opposite them, is the city of Jericho. So this is where he also, this King Eglon, enters the land of Israel and begins his conquest through this same city, through the city of Jericho. the Israelites were subject to King Eglon of Moab for 18 years. So beforehand, Cushan had 8 years, and then they were able to repel him through Othniel. Now they're actually much longer, 18 years already under the thumb of Moab. Now he gathers with him the Ammonites. Now we know the Moabites and the Ammonites are not only relatives, but they are right next to each other. Amalekites, who are they? The Amalek, we know, we've seen them in the past. They are basically desert nomads, plunderers, violent people. And we see them all across the area. They're in the Sinai Desert. Picture the map of Israel today, the Sinai Desert across the Negev into where Saudi Arabia today and Jordan. They're these wild nomadic tribes that it's very easy for anyone who says, okay, come, we're picking a fight. These are the guys you want to call because they're violent people and they're always eager for a fight. Now, if we will recall back in the book of Exodus, they are the first people that attack the nation of Israel after they leave Egypt. They attack them in Rephidim, which is in a place right close to the Red Sea in the Sinai Desert. And it is at that point that God says to Moses, who says to the nation of Israel, you must eventually erase Amalek. And they're seen to be really a source of evil because it's not like they have territorial interest. They're not looking to, there's no clash of civilizations. There's no conflict between them and anyone else. They go to war because they like to go to war. And we see that here. This is just Moab. Who's Amalek? They're not related, but he knows if he just says to Amalek, come to war, they'll come to war with him. So that's just gives you a little bit more background there. Okay. Then the Israelites cried out to the Lord, and the Lord raised up a champion for them, the Benjamites, Ehud, son of Gera, a left-handed man. Now, the fact that he's a Benjamite is very significant because, and this is something, it's time to share just something to kind of remind you. Here we go. So if you can see this map, we've seen this map in the past. So Benjamin is this little teeny tribe over here, and you can see at the very edge of Benjamin, right on the Jordan River, is Jericho. So given the fact that Jericho is where this king has first invaded and where he has established his power base for ruling over the Israelites here in the land of Israel, it is very clear that it's the Benjamites who are going to take the lead because he is sitting in their territory. Okay, so what is he going to do? So Ehud made for himself a two-edged dagger. Now we learn here, by the way, that he's left-handed, and that, of course, becomes very, very significant in the story. Ehud made for himself a two-edged dagger, a gomed in length, which he girded on his right side under his cloak. Now, a two-edged dagger, what that is essentially a knife. Picture just a regular knife with both sides are, an even knife, with both sides are sharp with a point at the end. That's what he had. It seems that it was much more common in those times to have a sword, and a sword that one side would be sharp. So like you're going to cut someone's head off, you're going to go like that, and it's one side that's sharp. In this case, he takes a two-edged sword, and it's more like a knife. And it's very, very important here because he is creating a deception. He's walking in to a king's court armed, but he has to make it look like he doesn't have an arm. It's more like it's a knife. It's something that's not threatening, and it's for decoration. Okay. Now, and we'll see how that develops. So the first thing is he has this particular kind of knife, which it seems is not as prevalent as the sword. It's also much smaller. And if we can see what he does here, he girds it on his right side under his cloak. It's a much smaller weapon. It's something he can hide. Okay, you don't really see it. He presented and what happens is they decide to send a tribute, and they're sending him with this tribute. But he's using this opportunity. He's coming as if he's bringing a tribute, but actually he's going to use this as subterfuge to get what he needs to do. He presented the tribute to King Eglon of Moab. Now, Eglon was a very stout man. Now, it's very interesting. The word in Hebrew for he's a big fat guy, the word in Hebrew is bari. Bari means healthy. And it's interesting because in biblical times, the fatter you were, the healthier you were seen to be. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could do that today? Imagine how much ice cream and cookies we could eat. We'd be so fat and everybody would think we were healthy. But we don't live in those times, so it's a different way of looking at things. Anyway, he presented the tribute to King Eglon of Moab. Now, Eglon was a very stout man. When Ehud had finished presenting the tribute, he dismissed the people who had conveyed the tribute. But he himself returned from Selim near Gilgal and said, "Your Majesty, I have a secret message for you." Eglon thereupon commanded silence, so all those in attendance left his presence. And when Ehud approached him, he was sitting alone in his cool upper chamber. Ehud said, now some people translate as being actually some kind of a bathroom type situation because of what happens next. Ehud said, "I have a message for you from God," whereupon he rose from his seat. Reaching with his left hand, Ehud drew the dagger from his right side and drove it into Eglon's belly. The fat closed over the blade and the hilt went in after the blade, for he did not pull the dagger out of his belly and the filth came out. He basically, lost his bowels, and that's really what happens. So basically, what do we have here? Every detail in the story is significant. He has a different kind of knife that can be hidden, and it is on his right side. Now, since most people are right-handed, if they have a sword that they're going to use for battle, they're going to put it on their left side, so that with their right side, they can draw their sword from the left side and use it, okay? So if anyone is going to pat down somebody as they're coming into the king's court, they're going to pat him down on his left side because that's where his weapon would be. If his weapon is on the right side, nobody's going to even look there for it. Okay, so number one, he hit it. Number two, because he's a lefty, he's the opposite. He's using his left hand to pull a weapon off of his right side, a place where no one would even look for a weapon. And the fact that Eglon is so fat is what makes the difference here, because he puts the knife in and it's not seen because it goes all the way into his, folds and folds of fat. And therefore, it will end up buying Ehud time before anyone really figures out what has happened. Okay? Stepping out into the vestibule, Ehud shut the doors of the upper chamber on him and locked them. After he left, the courtiers returned. When they saw that the doors of the upper chamber were locked, they thought he must be relieving himself in the cool chamber. This is why we assume it's some kind of a bathroom. They waited a long time, and when he did not open the doors of the chamber, they took the key and opened them, and there their master was lying dead on the floor. So meanwhile, all this is happening. Ehud is gone. He's bought a lot of time here. But Ehud had made good his escape while they delayed. He had passed Selim and escaped to Seirah. When he got there, he had the ram's horn sounded through the hill country of Ephraim, and all the Israelites descended with him from the hill country, and he took the lead. "Follow me closely," he said, "for the Lord has delivered your enemies, the Moabites, into your hands." They followed him down and seized the fords of the Jordan against the Moabites. They let no one cross. On that occasion, they slew about 10,000 Moabites. They were all robust and brave men, yet not one of them escaped. On that day, Moab submitted to Israel, and the land was tranquil for 80 years. Okay, so we have here an amazing thing that's happened. He tricked them all, then brought in the army, and keep in mind when you have the king is dead, especially in ancient times. It wasn't a democracy. Everything focuses on the king. When the king is dead, the army is in disarray. So it becomes much easier for even a smaller, more ragtag kind of army that Ehud was able to put together to come in and, take over and really decimate them, which is what he does. And he totally defeats Moab. They surrender, and then we have the land quiet for 80 years. 80 years, twice 40. So in this way, the scripture is telling us this was an amazing victory. it wasn't the standard, which was Othniel, 40 years. This is twice that. This was such an amazing victory. And I have to assume from this also, Ehud becomes such an amazing leader of the nation that he is able to keep things at bay for 80 years. And 80 years, I don't believe it's just a question of you have created a certain degree of deterrence because you've defeated your enemy, but it's also that you've maintained a spiritual level that's a higher spiritual level for that 80 years, because otherwise God would have by then, sent in more, they would sin, and God would send in another enemy. And even if we look at the first verse of chapter 4, the Israelites again did what was offensive to the Lord, Ehud now being dead. So you have this definite idea that thanks to Ehud's leadership, not only did they defeat the Moabites, but they also keep the nation together where it needs to be spiritually for this whole 80 years. Now, we're kind of out of time. Maybe I'll wait and do this next week. Do you want to spend another few minutes? I don't have any. Yes, is it okay?
Yeah.
Because then we'll just easily finish the chapter.
Yeah,
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's just look at this. I shared here, I basically took the text of the Ehud story and I have written it up in a kind of funny way. This is called a Schiastic model. Schiastic is Greek for an X, okay? But basically what happens is you could see how I did it. The first and last section are all the way out. The second to last is further in. The middle further in, and then there's a middle one. And basically what this shows is there's a structure here where the beginning sections are parallel to the last sections, and the middle, that one little verse 21 in the middle, is a turning point, where the beginning of the story sets forth the problem, the middle is the turning point, and the end shows you the resolution. And by seeing the parallel of each section, you kind of appreciate that the structure is so amazing, because it's not just how God tells this story or how the prophet tells the story, but that even the structure itself brings home to us how this is an amazing miracle and of delivery. So the first paragraph here sets up the fact that the last verse 14 kind of summarizes the first paragraph. The Israelites were subject to Eglon, king of Moab, for 18 years. Now look at the final sentence of the last paragraph. That day Moab was made subject to Israel, and the land had peace for 80 years. So the last paragraph represents a total reversal of the first paragraph, okay? But the first paragraph sets out the problem. The next paragraph is getting ready to deal with the problem, and that's Ehud and his preparations. And we have all these little details that end up becoming very, very important, how Ehud basically plans this whole scenario, okay? Now, in the third paragraph, we have basically how Ehud tricks Eglon two different ways, okay? One thing he says, I have a secret message for you, in which case he sends them all out. And the second thing he says is, I have a message to you from God, in which case he stands up. Both of those things are tricking Eglon in such a way so he puts him in a position where there's no one in the room and where he stands up, so it makes it easier for him to stab him. And of course, the climax, the turning point, is when Ehud plunges the knife into the king's belly. Okay, then we have the situation coming back through its conclusion. In the next paragraph, we have a parallel to the double, in the paragraph just above that starts with verse 19, we have the double deceit of Ehud to Eglon. And in the beginning of chapter 22, we have the double deceit of Ehud to the servants of Eglon, which enables him to get away. Okay, so one talks about the fact that he's so fat that the blade is hidden in the folds of his fat. And the second was that he goes out and locks the door, creating the impression that Eglon is relieving himself, and therefore he buys time. The second to last paragraph, we see that Ehud goes away and plans the war, very much parallel to the second paragraph, where he prepares is the attack on Eglon, and the second to last paragraph, he prepares the over-out war. And of course, as we showed, the final paragraph totally solves the problem that we said in the first paragraph, and parallel to it as well. The day Moab was made subject to Israel, the exact opposite of the fact that in the first paragraph, the Israelites were subject to Eglon. So I just like the way this structure works out, and I think it helps us see that it's such a neat, it's a neat structure, and it really is really very special. So that basically finishes our story of Ehud. The last two verses we'll take a look at next week. We will start next week with the very end of chapter 3 and move on to chapter 4. Stop share. Okay, sorry, went over a few minutes. If any of you have any questions or comments, turn on your mics. I'd love to hear from you.
If you're going to be traveling, will you be doing the study next week?
Oh, thank you for reminding me. Next week, I was going to put that on a writing. Next week, we will not be meeting because I will have just landed or still be on a plane or whatever. So next week, we will not meet. In 2 weeks, we will meet. Okay, I will be on the West Coast. I will be in Seattle, but I have set aside that time, which is morning, as opposed to evening here in Israel. It will be 8 o'clock in the morning, and I have set aside that time, and I will be teaching you from my hotel room in Seattle. That's in 2 weeks. So next week, we do have to cancel. I'm very sorry about that, but I can't teach when I'm on a plane. But in 2 weeks, we will resume. Okay, and I will send you, when I send you out the recording of this, I will remind you of that as well. Barbara, I see you had a question.
Yes. Could you send us that chiasm?
That what?
That chiasm that you were.
The chiasm, yes, sure, of course.
Thank you.
I will absolutely. I don't know how to do it, but I will do it. Wait, is Katie on here or Kim? Are one of you on? Whatever. I don't know. I don't know how to do that. I have to attach it or maybe embed it in the email. I'll figure it out and I'll send it to you. Yes.
Thank you.
With pleasure. Claudette, you had a question.
Just an observation. It's interesting in reading this part of Judges is that at no point did it say that the people goes to the Mishkan. It seems that it was all neglected by neglecting God, and the troubles come from the fact that they neglected God, so they couldn't pass on the tradition to the next generation.
I think you're very right. It was very interesting about the Mishkan, about the tabernacle. We do see at the end of the book, when things get really, really bad, they do go and seek God, but it's not mentioned. Shiloh isn't mentioned. They don't go to Shiloh.
They couldn't even find Shiloh at the end of the book. They had to give a long direction.
At the very end, right. But before there, when they go and they seek God in the civil war, they don't seem to seek him in Shiloh. They seem to go to the high priest. It could be in Shiloh, but it's not mentioned. And it's a very interesting point. Thank you for that. Yes, absolutely. Lynn, did you want to say something?
Yes, you mentioned when you're talking, for example, in Judges, perhaps I've lost my space. You were saying about quoting from a Bible and saying the Hebrew is poor. I was wondering which Bible you were quoting, because my Bible, which is the New King James, actually has the words that you're using.
What verse are we?
The verse about verse 8.
Oh, verse 6. They serve their gods, and things like that. When you were illustrating how.
Yeah, no, it did say serve, but it didn't say
by selling and enslaved.
Selling. It's look at verse 8.
Verse 8.
What does it say on verse 8? Read this sentence in verse 8.
He sold them into the hand of the Cush.
Okay, so that's excellent. No, my Bible is a Jewish Publication Society, which is a Jewish translation, and sometimes I like it better and sometimes I like it worse. So in this case, you're King James 1.
New King James.
New King James.
Yeah.
So
and
take out the these and thous. Okay, good.
Oh,
good,
no,
good.
it doesn't have the these and the thous.
Right, that's why it's new.
It's the New King James, and it has the Hebrew in the margin as well.
Oh, excellent.
Gosh.
Excellent. Eva, you have a question.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment that in my German Bible, it's also selling in verse 8. That's number 1. And the actual question I want to ask is in verse 27, in my Bible, there's he's blowing the horn, and you said trumpet. Is it in the Hebrew the shofar? This is what I'm asking.
That's the ram's horn. It is the shofar.
It's
In the
the
English, it
shofar.
also says the ram's horn.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Said he
Oh.
had the ram's horn sounded through the whole country of Ephraim. Yeah, I think that's what I read. So yeah, it's the ram's horn, which is the shofar. Absolutely.
Okay. Thank
Yeah.
you.
You're
Oh,
welcome.
Actually, in the one good thing about the NIV, which are lots of are not, it also says sold and enslaved. So that's something.
Good.
That's
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Very good. Very good. Hi,
Okay.
Richard. Good to see you.
Shavua Tov, Shavua Tov.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Well, thank you all for joining us. And
Uh-oh, I
again,
had
next
it.
week we will not meet, but we will meet, please God, in 2 weeks. And I will be. Okay.
Have a nice
Bye-bye.
trip.
And safe journey, safe journey.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I hope you enjoyed that video, and we'd like to be sure you're getting all of our video content. So just click on the subscribe button below as well as on the notification bell, and that way you will have easy access to all our material. We look forward to staying in touch with you. God bless you and have a wonderful day.